I am Guadalupe Alione. I am the Student Caucus leader for the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. And in this installment of our Meet the Author series, Margit Warburg will discuss her recent article, Forest Burials in Denmark, Nature, Non-Religion and Spirituality, published in Approaching Religion journal. Margit Warburg is Doctor of Philosophy and Professor Emerita of Sociology of Religion, University of Copenhagen. Theoretically, her research interests are the relationship between religion and migration, religion and globalization, religion and demography, religious minorities, secular rituals, and civil religion. Empirically, she has published books and articles on Baha'is, on Jews, on new religion, on the teaching of religion in schools, on the Evangelical Lutheran Church, on the Danish Church abroad. Her doctorate of philosophy was Citizens of the World, a history and sociology of the Baha'is from a globalization perspective. She has published in, among other journals, journals of ritual studies, Nordic Journal of Religion and Society, Social Compass, Journal of Church and State, Journal of Contemporary Religion, Journal of Religion in Europe, and Implicit Religion. So now I will leave you the floor to you, Margit, so you do your presentation, and after that we'll have a moment to do some Q&A, which I will be moderating. So thank you again, Margit, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will start by sharing the screen, if that works. Just a minute. Now you can probably, could you see the slides?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, wonderful. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to Laurie Beeman and Nathan Alexander for arranging this seminar, where we can discuss my article on forest burials in Denmark. I hope that the sharing of the PowerPoints will work for everybody. Otherwise, please tell us. I should add that Laurie and Nathan has also prepared a podcast with me where we discuss forest burials. So in the first part of the webinar, I'll summarize the main theoretical issues and empirical findings covered by the article. However, time is not standing still, and towards the end, I'll supplement with a later study of forest burial ceremony that took place at a burial site. The material is prepared for publication in another article publication. It hasn't been published yet, please note that, and it hasn't been written yet either, so please notice that. So I'll begin with a brief presentation of the forest burial institution in Denmark and other European countries. The concept of forest burials was originally developed in Switzerland and Germany about 20 years ago. The Danish forest burials are modeled over the German ones, but they're not identical. Like in Germany, only ashes from cremated bodies are allowed for burial in the forest. And this is different from the practice of natural burials in Britain and the Netherlands, where it's possible to bury the whole body in a biodegradable coffin or shroud to be left for decomposition. So in Denmark, forest burials were permitted by law in 2008 after a non-confessional alternative, as a non-confessional alternative to the established cemeteries owned and run by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Denmark. This law was a break with the century-old monopoly of the church as administrator of burials in Denmark, because the forest burial sites do not belong to the church and the land is not consecrated by a Christian ritual. So forest burials outside the Evangelical Lutheran Church are primarily offered by private operators among the larger estates. And they already own suitable pieces of forest land, and the landlords, they see the forest burials as an additional source of income to the forestry. So I have studied Danish forest burials since late 2020 as part of my current research interest in non-religion. My primary material was gathered in field studies, where I participated in a number of conducted tours arranged by the forest owners with the purpose of attracting customers to the forest burial concept. In total, I've spoken with nearly 50 participants at these tours. The interviews were brief and concentrated on the interviewees' motives for considering buying a forest burial plot. In addition, I had a longer interview and correspondence with the leading Danish operator of forest burials, who has 25 individual estates as clients in an umbrella organization called Skovbegravelse Nu. In this interview, I learned that between half and 2/3 of the buyers of forest burial sites so far were members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. So being buried in the forest does not necessarily mean that the deceased was non-religious, and I'll revert to this issue towards the end. So to choose a forest burial is an unconventional choice, and it's not a trivial matter. I'll argue that the choice of being buried in the forest touches upon important aspects of one's identity. I've therefore structured the interview material according to 3 dimensions of identity, denoted knowing, doing, and being. The 3 dimensions are manifested in both attitudes and behavior, and they're not mutually exclusive. Instead, they supplement each other, and sometimes one dimension is particularly emphasized and sometimes another, depending on the specific context. So on the next slide, I present a closer contextual definition of the 3 dimensions within their general definition, as first outlined by sociolinguist Joshua A. Fishman in 1980, and later elaborated by myself, primarily in my study of the Baha'is. So, knowing. That would require that the informant expresses some reflective or existential considerations to the choice of a forest burial. And doing is that the informant expresses his or her thoughts about specific actions in connection with the burial of the urn, for example, holding a ceremony at the site. And then being is about the informant's feelings for a burial in the forest, for example, that the forest offers a specific aesthetic or a spiritual feeling, or a special linking to the history or identity of the nation. I'll present 2 examples where respondents were non-members of the church and clearly irreligious, and their motives fit with the knowing dimension. So the first is a single man of about 65 years of age, retired without a wife and children, but he had a brother family. He was not religious and not a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. And he said, therefore, a place like this suits me particularly well. Okay. In that next example, the interviewee also takes an active position on the alternative ash scattering. I was a woman of 70 years, and she said, one of the reasons why I have chosen a forest burial is because it's not consecrated ground. I do not believe the world is spiritual, and I do not believe in reincarnation. I do not want to go to church before the urn is to be set down. And the sea has never told me anything, so I do not want to have the ashes scattered. So the following 2 examples, interviews represent cases where the concept of forest burial is clearly compatible with religion. The first example is a that's primarily an expression of doing. That was a middle-aged mother with her daughter. I believe in God, and I've made a plan. My plan is that my urn should be present in the church, and then after church, we can drive directly to the forest. I'm a member of 3 gospel choirs, so I wonder if one of them would come and sing here. And the next example is primary being, by emphasizing the spiritual aspects of being buried in the forest. That was a married couple in the 60s, and they were both members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and they would definitely have a service in the church before being buried in the forest. They were very sure of that. The wife said, "Nature is also divine, and there is something sacred about nature. Maybe this is especially true in Denmark." Before I began this study, I expected that forest burials offered an opportunity of studying non-religion in practice. This still so true. However, I soon learned that the forest burial concept attracts a wide audience with a variety of motives for considering the option of a forest burial. For example, quite a few of my informants were primarily attracted by the very idea of being buried in a forest instead of in a cemetery. The following statement encapsulates two of the often expressed arguments for choosing a forest burial. "We love the forest. We are walking in the forest every day, and our children eventually do not have to look after the graveside. We are the last generation to care for the graves," as she said. These arguments, love of the forest and considerations for not burdening the children with the obligation of tending the grave, they do not address the possible non-religious character of forest burials, however. So this raises a question, namely, how do we consider forest burials in relation to non-religion? So among my interviews, UEs, many of those who were members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church wished to have a funeral in the church before cremation and the later burial of the urn in the forest. In my view, such use of the forest burial institution is not within the idea of non-religion, because the burial of the urn in the forest is actually a continuation of a religious ritual. So some of my informants expressed ideas of spirituality, which they associated with nature and in particular with the forest. For example, the woman I quoted before who said nature is also divine and there's something sacred about nature. And I think it's an interesting question how expressions of nature spirituality fit into our current understanding of non-religion. I've no ready answer for this, but I'll emphasize that such beliefs are not new, and that there is a historical connection between 19th century Romanticism and present-day trends in forest spirituality. Romanticism spurred a spiritual adoption of nature, and in particular of the forest, and pantheistic ideas prevailed among leading intellectuals. For example, a key concept in German nature poetry and painting at that time was the spiritual value of experiencing loneliness in the forest. In German, that is Waldeinsamkeit. The telling word in German, Waldeinsamkeit, has in fact come into vogue today, also in the English-speaking world. There were strong connections between poets and philosophers in Germany and New England in the first half of the 1800s. Forced spirituality was promulgated by, in particular, Henry David Thoreau's famous writings on living in Waldeinsamkeit in the woods of New England near Walden Pond. He was among the leading transcendentalists of his time, where a core belief was in the holistic power of nature and the idea of dwelling in the woods. In the article, I quote a couple for saying that being buried in the forest meant that, quote, they would be united with the tree, grow with the tree, and come all the way up to the canopy where they could look up and out. So Waldo Emerson, the founder of Transcendentalism, expressed the same idea of a physical and spiritual unification of all living by the words, quote, the currents of the universal being circulate through me, and I am part or particle of God. Unquote. The transcendentalist literary heritage is clearly discernible in much of the expressions of nature spirituality. I find it of great interest to discuss how nature spirituality fits with our understanding of non-religion without diluting the concept of non-religion too much. For example, I've been thinking about the contemplative enjoyment of the forest in the form of the Japanese shirin-yoku, or what forest bathing is a popular therapy form. Its practice resembles meditation and other spiritual techniques. Is that non-religion or not? Now, I will proceed to a case which doesn't involve forest spirituality. It was a rare chance of studying a forest burial ceremony through participatory fieldwork. Forest burials are such a recent and relatively rare phenomenon that there are few opportunities for the public to attend a forest burial, also because they're rarely announced. As part of my research, I routinely check death notices in the newspapers, and one of them caught my attention. It announced that a woman of 67 years had died, and that a memorial ceremony was to take place on a certain date, November 2020, at Seltzer Forest Burial Site. I contacted the two daughters of the deceased and got their permission to join and study the ceremony as part of my research. In January 2023, I also interviewed one of the daughters, and the deceased had been a political active person of a left-wing party. She and her family was explicitly non-religious, and they were not members of any religious community. Her two daughters decided that a forest burial suited their understanding of their mother's life, the life perspective. And the Seltzer Forest Burial Site, about 35 kilometers west of Copenhagen, was the closest to where they lived. So, from the outset, this forest burial ceremony was a clear example of non-religion. So the Seltzer burial site area is quite large, 7.5 hectares, and is dominated by 80-year-old high-steam beech trees. The ceremony took part on a special ceremonial site on a low hill with open vegetation. In the center lies a flat boulder with benches around. The urn was placed on the top of a flat boulder, and those of the more than 50 guests who had brought flowers placed them on the boulder. There was a ceremony master who was also a local undertaker. So, the first burial ceremony began at 11 a.m. with the undertaker playing Canadian singer-songwriter Joni Mitchell's Both Sides Now on a soundbox that he had brought. The song is included in the popular Danish high school songbook. Then followed speeches by the closest family, alternating with community singing. In the speech by the eldest daughter, she emphasized that her mother was a socialist, she was a non-believer, and she saw her approaching death as simply bad luck. Her speech was followed by community singing, "Sig nærmer tiden, da jeg må væk," "The time is approaching when I must leave." It is a popular Christian elegy from 1838, a peak time in Danish Romanticism. It describes the poet's longing for deliverance from the miseries of present earthly life. Another song was the classic communist song called Internationale. I noted that during the community singing, one of the participants was standing with raised right arm and clenched fist, as was earlier the tradition in the socialist movement. Then followed speeches from other families and a friend. So then the program finished with the popular Danish nature lyric from around 1868, and it had some elements of nature spirituality. For example, that in the forest the soul often listened to the birds' happy singing. After the ceremony, the participants went down a couple of 100 meters or so to the burial site, which was close to the edge of the forest facing the fjord. The ceremony master did not join this part of the funeral ceremony. The burial site had been prepared in advance. The hole for the urn was dug, and bins with sand, gravel, and shovels were already ready. People attended while the two daughters placed the urn in the hole and buried it. Everybody was silent. When the daughters had finished, some of the participants came and placed their flowers in the graveside, which was also decorated with the red feminist flag. Here you see. Then the party broke up and walked to the cars to join the after-funeral lunch in the neighboring inn. So this forest funeral ceremony had a structure and ritual elements which are similar to classic Danish Christian funeral with coffin burial. For example, it's common to begin with a piece of music in the church with no community singing in order to put the audience in a contemplative mood. It's also typical that there is a community singing in between the spoken words. After a Christian service in the church, the participants walked to the prepared grave in the churchyard, and and here they stand in silence while members of the family lower the coffin into the grave. With the coffin in place, the pastor performs the obligatory committal rite with the casting of earth in the coffin 3 times. Likewise, the Celtic forest burials, the participants witnessed in silence that the two daughters placed the urn into the prepared hole. However, there were no ritual words said when the urn was covered with sand and gravel, obviously. So, in many ways, I think that the Celtic forest burial ceremony fits with leading definitions of non-religion. It's a collective ritual, which is related to religion, as funerals are in general. However, the forest funeral also represents an other to religion because it took place in non-consecrated ground. The behavior of the ritualized agents, in particular the two daughters with their speeches and the man with the raised fist, further emphasize the non-religious character of the ceremony. In ritual studies, the prevailing view is that religious and non-religious rituals have much in common theoretically. I propose that it is fruitful to approach the non-religious rituals with the theoretical tools developed originally for the study of religious rituals. So in the late 1880s, the Scottish historian of religion, William Robertson Smith, proposed that in the historical development of religion, the rituals should be regarded as a primary and stable, and the myths are secondary and variable. The myths are sometimes, but not always, attempts of explaining a particular ritual. This proposal still stands today as a fundamental tenet in ritual studies within the studies of religion and social anthropology. The striking similarities between the present forest burial ceremony and the traditional Lutheran funeral service comply with this tenet. The myth in the Christian funeral ritual is the resurrection of the dead. In the non-religious funeral ritual, there is no proper myth, but just a claim that there is no afterlife. Because the traditional funeral ritual is the primary and the stable, the ceremony in the forest is immediately recognizable for the participants as a proper funeral ceremony. So, to round out the discussion of how we consider forest burials in relation to non-religion, I see the forest burial institution as a non-religious vessel, which the bereaved can fill with ideas and acts as they wish. In the Seltzer forest burial case, the ceremony, among other things, focused on the political life of the deceased. The very first speech further emphasized that the deceased was a non-believer, and the ritual singing of the Internationale and the raising of the clenched fist were markedly non-religious. However, the ceremony also had elements of, for example, a typical Danish Lutheran heritage, which complies with the vessel pick and choose metaphor. So I think that the forest burials in Denmark exemplify institutionalized non-religion, and the concepts attracts both non-members and members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. It seems that forest burials fulfill demands with the existing which the existing cemeteries do not satisfy. The yearly number of forest burials in Denmark still count less than 1% of the burials at the conventional cemeteries. However, the data reported in the article indicate a significant growth so far, and it is therefore likely that in Denmark, forest burials will become a distinct alternative to the existing cemeteries on the one hand, and to ash scattering in the sea on the other hand. So thank you. I think that was half an hour. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Margit. It was excellent, super interesting presentation. So now we open the floor. I see some people clapping. Now I open the floor for questions. You can raise your hand and unmute yourselves to ask the question yourselves, or you can write it and then I can read it. So the floor is open for questions. Peter, please go ahead.
Thank you, Margit. That was very, very interesting. It's a subject that I've been thinking about as well. Haven't gotten around to researching it yet, but it's something that I've thought about. I have a question about, we know that in most Western countries, non-religious identities have grown significantly over the past 30, 40 years, and that it's not entirely, but significantly also a generational thing. I was at a forest burial place near my place up in just north of Montreal in Quebec, and wandered around and watched, noticed a lot of things about it that that were quite interesting. But one of the things that I noticed is the virtual absence of the 90-year-olds. In fact, I had this feeling that these were my contemporaries dying around me. Right? They were most of them were my age, a little bit older, often quite much younger. And I noticed that a couple of the people that you cited there were in their 60s. At least the one woman, the socialist there, she was in her 60s. And so I wondered whether in your research this possibility of this being as generational in its growth as non-religion is, it also comes up, or whether that's not as contradicted in the Danish case.
It's interesting. Well, the material is really scarce, obviously, so it's difficult to tell yet. But and also because those that die are in their older age, although they're not in. I didn't see any in the 90s, or some in the 80s I've seen. But those that went along to study at the tours were those that were able to walk, able to ask, and able to join the people that were showing the forest. So there might be 90-year-old these sitting at home and they were not able to go there. I remember there was one man, however, who was there in order to take care of his mother, and he was in the 60s, so his mother probably would be in the 90s. But I could find out because this person from the nobility, those that have the estates, and this person who's taking care of all the forests, he would have the ages of those that are buried, actually, and it might be interesting to check that out as well. Because when he knows that whether they're members of the church or not, then he would know how old they are as well. So that would be interesting. I like the question. I'll write it down.
Thank you for that, Margit and Peter. Chris, please go ahead.
Hi, Margit. Thanks so much. Fantastic presentation. I'm curious about you thinking of the, environmental spirituality. Can you talk about the choice to be cremated that people are making? Is this just like the only option? Is this dominant in Denmark anyways? Is it just like, that's the only thing to do if I want a forced burial, so I might as well do it? And then do people balance the kind of like ecological costs and, carbon costs of cremation versus wanting to end up in nature?
Well, it's not possible in Denmark to have, the whole body as it is in the fields, or it's only possible. Well, where are you? It's only possible in a coffin in a church, at a church. So that's the only place you can do it. I know that in Great Britain, for example, it's possible you could be buried in the fields. This is not possible, but it is, to answer your question, it's very, very common to be cremated. It is becoming more and more common from, peasants usually used to be buried in the farmer's church, and that would always be a coffin burial. But now, with the urbanization, everybody is cremated, and they would not think of it as ecologically more correct to be cremated than to be buried. That not yet. That is a very small percentage of the population that would have that those thoughts, I think. Is that would that be a question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Laurie, please go ahead.
Hi, Margit. Thanks for being here. I've heard a little bit about this research because of the podcast you mentioned, but it's really good to hear a more elaborated version. And these are really just a couple of comments to think with you. The link to romanticism is one that I've heard a couple of times when I've presented some of this stuff on the environment and non-religion. And I'm not really sure what to make of it. And I really appreciate your drawing that in as a link. I'm wondering how we might go about making a contextual comparison with the present day, and the turn to non-religion, if you will. And I know that's a sort of broad statement, but there is something definitely shifting, especially in traditionally majoritarian Christian countries. How can we make sense of this? And are there similarities of context, and what are the differences, perhaps? And I don't know, but I want to think about that. And while I have you here and your incredible intellect, I'd like to brainstorm that with you. So I'm taking advantage of that moment. And it seems to me that maybe there's a more imminent crisis, which is the climate crisis, that may be framing some of this, but I'm not positive, and that's perhaps reading too much into it. The other thing is sort of drawing on the idea that we need to think about these rituals using the frames we have to think about religious rituals. And I'm always a little bit nervous about religion-like analyses, because I'm not sure what we get from those, but I'm willing to go down that path with you, but I'm also wondering if we're in a period of transition. I'm not saying religion, in particular Christianity, is going to disappear, but I'm wondering, yeah, I'm just wondering if it's actually a period of transition. Sorry, I'm not being very articulate, but that's because I've been thinking about this and don't know how to say it. If we're in a period of transition where the only way people know how to make sense of these things, or that we can make sense of them, is the religion-like category. And here I'm thinking about, just to give an analogy, I'm also a marriage celebrant. And what strikes me always is the similarity, like the way people can't think out of what would look like a Christian ceremony. They can't get out of that frame because that's all they know, but they know they don't want a Christian ceremony, which is this really weird, I sort of see it as a transition period. So I'm not sure. Again, I just would really appreciate your thoughts on these things.
So I'll start with the last one, with the what you call religion-like. Richard, thank you so much for asking, and I really appreciate your questions. But I thought that now these especially the non-believers, they had a wonderful possibility of creating new rituals. If they were non-religious and they wanted to go to a forest, like for instance these two girls, the daughters, why didn't they just invent some new ritual? Why not? And why would they have to have this undertaker play the Joni Mitchell play? Why couldn't they just do it themselves, or why couldn't they do something else? It's even more than I mentioned in the talk, because it's you had the the little setting when they had with the boulder, and then they walked with the urn down to the place where they could put the urn in the hole, which is exactly, if you will, like in a church where you take the coffin and then the coffin is taken down into a hole in the churchyard. So it's even more than I explained before. And I agree with you also with the wedding ceremonies. It's the same. It's also the same in Eastern Europe, where they have had this communist anti-religious wedding houses in, say, Lithuania, where I heard from Milda. That's the same. It's the same. They have difficulty. I don't know whether they have difficulty. That means that they have tried, but they will have the same rituals, but just without God, or without Jesus, or without any spirituality, and maybe a little spirituality, but that's it. And one thing is that people should recognize it as a proper, as I said, as a proper funeral. They should recognize what is happening. People should get married, and they should feel that this is a true marriage and a true funeral. So they have to have a little like it, I think. And also, my explanation was this Robertson Smith explanation that the rituals are the stable and the myths are the variable. And I think that's enough for me. I don't know whether they're religion-like. I would say they're ritual-like. So rituals work, maybe not religion, but the ritual would work. So that's my answer. And then you have this question about the climate and whether the climate and the crisis, the imminent crisis, and with that the climate, whether one of the reasons it's also like Chris also speculated there before with the climate and the ecological thoughts, and whether that would be one of the reasons why people would want to get married in a forest. And and of course there would be some that would be the reason, but that would be an extra reason. At least those that I talked with, that would be extra. They love the forest, and the forest would be the primary reason. They want to see it in the spring, and they were walking with their dog, and they were walking with their parents, and they want to. That's a forest. Of course, there's a push and a pull. The push is the forest, and the church is the push, and then the forest is the pull. But the climate comes very low down there, I think. It's when I would say, is the climate important? Oh, yes, I'll say, yeah. Maybe, yeah. Yeah, of course, if you say so, sort of. Yeah, so not yet in the northern countries, not yet. I think. Also, as Peter said, these people are in the 60s and 70s, maybe, or maybe 80s, we'll see, 90s maybe. And maybe these, I don't know, is awareness of the climate, is that a generational thing as well? If it is, then there's a possibility for further younger generations that would take more care about the climate. So that might be a generational thing if it exists in Northern Europe. I think perhaps it would exist more in the Netherlands. They're a little, maybe. Then you had a question about the Romanticism and whether this was, it was a bit difficult to understand your question, but that was, well, I could see that there are things that look very much alike the Romanticism. And do you remember this photo I showed from the Danish woods where this was a painting, Romanticist painting, which was very, very Danish and very, very nice, and with beaches that we love, and so it's also a nationalistic thing, at least I think in Denmark. I don't know whether the Walden Pond and Emerson is. I wouldn't. Are they nationalistic as well? Are they? Yeah. I can't.
Individualism.
Yeah.
Individualism. That's how it taps into nationalism in the US.
Yeah, I would think so. So that's another point. I think it resembles very much, and I think the forest in itself is becoming more and more interesting. Also, do you have this Japanese forest bathing in Canada and the United States? Yeah. And I think that's interesting as well. Is that non-religion? I think the spiritual part is difficult to know whether it's religion or non-religion. I don't have the answer, but I think.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Another research question, Margit.
But I think, I think it's important, and I think it's extreme. Is the spirituality is so common, and a lot of people. I mean, this woman who had, she felt that she would go all the way up in the forest, up in the tree, in the canopy. That's exactly the same as Emerson, I would say. Very close. So I don't know what your question was, but I do think they look alike. In Europe, we don't know anything about Thoreau and Emerson. We don't know. Only North Americans would know.
Great. Thank you so much for that interesting discussion, both Margit and Lori. I have a question, Margit, actually. In the article you mentioned that you asked interviewees if they were members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and the non-members answered they weren't, and sometimes they remarked that they had resigned a long time ago. And this question is kind of collateral, to the discussion we're having here, but I was wondering, how is the resignation process in Denmark? Because in Argentina, this kind of process is very difficult and bureaucratic, and we have even activism oriented to, that is called a collective apostasy, to leave the Catholic Church, and it's a very bureaucratic process, and many people start this process, but then they give up because they don't want to follow it and everything. So I was wondering how the process was in Denmark.
Yeah, that's a good question, as all the questions have been good questions. But it's much easier. It's much easier. It's by the law, you could just download a piece of paper and send it in, and then you're resigned. That's by law. But the local priest should have to sign. So some of the priests would say, could you please come to my office and we can discuss this? And if you come and you say, I'm not a religious person, then he says, okay, then you sign. That's it. But some people would find it take it too personal and not that very nice to enter his or her office, but it's possible. Actually, I had a colleague, a professor in philosophy, who was a non-believer, and he collected all those resignment papers, and he had 50 or 60 resignment, and he gave it out in his class. And that gave a big roar, because is that ethical? Or is that not ethical? As a professor of philosophy, it wasn't ethical, it showed. And he had some difficulties afterwards. But that's it's not so difficult. And it's quite common. When you become 18, you cannot do it before 18. And of course, you're a member of the Danish Lutheran Church when you're baptized. That's the way you become a member, as in the Catholic Church, right? Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that. Peter, please go ahead.
This discussion is fascinating. I want to go to your three dimensions, we call it, the knowing, doing, being, yes. And I also noticed that, as we were talking about, that there seems to be a tremendous variety of approaches, and that's all. I almost had the suspicion that the only thing that all these incidents or examples have in common is that they involve this forest burial, right? So I'm wondering, at least I know you're not doing a sample research and stuff like that, but in what you've come across do you find any commonality or trend or pattern, either in knowing, doing, or being?
Yes, of course, knowing, doing, and being are only part of the reasons why they wanted to be buried in the forest. But these would be some of the motives for doing it. We've already talked about other motives. I think that love of the forest is important for everybody. They really love the forest. They love the smell. They love their history in the forests. They love this. I asked them also, could you go to any forest and become buried there? Or, I mean, could it be in Jutland instead of Zealand? Or, we have different parts in Denmark. No, it has to be this forest. So every day we walk with the dog in this forest, and our children did this and this. So it is a love of a forest, and it's also a love of a local forest. And that would be That would be a common nature, I think. But not all of them. Some of the non-religious, they just looked up what's the closest for me. It's more the religious, I think the non-religious really looked for a forest, whereas the other ones, they had long time thought that it had to be this forest. Yeah, I think so. Because the non-religiosity was so important for the non-religious. So the forest was not as important as being non-religious and a non-consecrated ground. Yes. Chris has, please.
Yes, please go ahead,
Yeah,
Chris.
I don't know if your data gets at this, but you talked about the people who are buried and why they want it. But for the bereaved who know someone who was buried, does that site continue to have importance in their lives? Is it like, I need to go to this forest because that is where my father, mother, brother is? Or can I be anywhere in nature? Or is that person now dead? So it doesn't matter. They're gone. They don't exist. Like, how...
That's a good question. Great question. I should mention that all the trees in this particular place, there's some place in any of the woods, forest, which are meant to be the place where you can have the urns buried. So it's not all over the forest. It's only this part of the forest, and these part of the forest would have numbers on the trees. So they would have 1, 2, 3, 5, small numbers. It doesn't show much, but they have numbers. And when you go around and you have a look for your tree, then you decide it should be number 86, and I would like to sit there or be buried there. So the relatives, they would know that your tree is number 86, for instance, and the dead people, or those that want to be buried there, they say that it would be very nice for my family to go there and have a look at number 83 and say, this is grandmother, and she's there. And some of the places would have little plaques where you could have your name close to the tree. So they would work as tombstones, not really, but it's in Germany, it is much more like a tombstone, much more. They would even have hearts where it say, grandmother, I love you. And these hearts would be red, and they would have little extra stones from children, and they would be very colorful. They would have parking spots, and this way to the forest burials, and they would have toilets because there would be and benches. Whereas in Denmark, it would be, the leaves would go down and the whole thing is there. So the forest people that helps the forest, the burials, they would take all these flowers the day after and remove them. And the feminist flag as well.
Okay, I think we have reached the end or to this our last installment or the Meet the Author event with Margit Warburg. I want to thank her again for being here, Margit. It was a really interesting and very novel presentation. So I'm very thankful for that. And I will leave the floor for Nathan to tell you some new info about the next steps and the next events. So I want to thank you all again for being here, and I will see you in the next events.
Thank you so much for joining. I think, and thank you both, Laurie and Nathan, for making this happen. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Margit, and everyone for joining. I just included some links down in the chat. For the next Meet the Author, it's with Sebastian Elsesser, and he's going to be talking about Arab non-believers and free thinkers on YouTube. So we've had to postpone that event. Initially, it was going to be in November, but we've had to postpone it. That we're still sorting out a date, but it's going to be sometime in early December, and around, like at the same time as this one. In any case, I included the link to register, and so even though the date's not set, you can still register, and then you'll get I think you'll get a notification when the date is finalized. And Margit mentioned as well that we have a podcast. The NCF has a podcast called the Life Stances Podcast, and our next episode will be about this topic, forest burials or green burials more broadly. And that episode should be out in a few weeks, we'll see. In any case, I've included the link to the podcast so you can subscribe there and or listen to the previous episodes. And I also included a link to our mailing list, but I think everyone who's here is likely already on the mailing list. But in any case, I included it. So yeah, so thanks, Margit, once again, and thanks everyone for the really interesting discussion.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day or night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Juana.